April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. The opening lines of the poem, which is considered to be the magnum opus of the modern poetry. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land first appeared in the magazine The Dial in 1922, marks its centenary this year. The iconoclastic poem, which was written in the backdrop of the First World War and many other disillusionments triggered by the modern age, gave birth to a new form of poetry breaking away from the conventional styles existed till then. One of the pioneers of modern poetry in Malayalam, bilingual critic and writer K Satchidanandan, recounts how the poem Waste Land influenced Malayalam poetry, especially his own writings.
Modern poetry in India has generally been impacted by the wasteland in a huge way. When I think of it, I find that in most of the languages, modern poetry began with people who either studied English as their major subject or by teachers of English, either in schools or perhaps more in colleges. And it is true to a great extent also about Malayalam. If you look at the major pioneer of modern Malayalam poetry, you know it is none other than Dr. Ayyappa Panikar. One could say that it was with him that modern poetry began in Malayalam. Not that these professors or poets were impacted directly by the wasteland, but there were indirect influences, especially in form. The major thing that the wasteland did is to tell the poets that it is no more necessary to confine yourself to existing forms and styles of poetry. You could use fragmented images. You need not have a kind of preconceived structure for the poem that you write. You could think of the world in ways other than what the earlier poets had thought about. And behind the very title, The Wasteland, you can find the influence of the politics of the world caught between two world wars. It is a prophetic poem on the one hand. On the other hand, it was also a poem that observed what was happening in history, especially in Europe. So the poets who began modern poetry in Indian languages, including Malayalam, also had in some way been indirectly influenced by the experiences that had inspired T.S. Eliot himself. But more than that, it was perhaps the formal freedom that the wasteland brought that influenced poets like Ayyappa Panikar and N.N. Kakkad and R. Ramachandran and many other poets who began modernism in Malayalam poetry, because they felt that they were freer, that they could use forms other than the existing conventional forms. They could break out of meter, for example. Many of them invented new meters. Sometimes they used free verse, and also they began the use of prose in poetry. I think what is important is the kind of formal freedom that the wasteland offered to the poets writing in those times. Along with that came the use of very concrete and modern kind of images, and the entire sculpture and the architecture of modern poetry was deeply impacted by the wasteland. So I would say that more than the influence of the content of the wasteland, it was the influence of the form that you could perhaps obtain in poets like Panikar and perhaps a whole generation of poets who wrote along with him. So language, metaphor, image, structure, form, architecture. Perhaps it was in these areas that the wasteland had its deepest impact in Malayalam, as it had also in many other languages in India. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, was part of our syllabus for English Masters, which I did in Maharaja's College in Ernakulam. So that was how I first got acquainted with the poem, the poet, and also the various implications of the poem. Much later, it was translated into Malayalam by Ayyappa Panikar. In my early poetry, you will find that mood of despair and disappointment and disillusionment that you may find in many of my early poems, perhaps had something to do with my acquaintance with the poem Waste Land. That is the first influence. And secondly, as I said about Panikkar and other poets, the Waste Land influenced me very deeply at the formal level. Because I began writing, in fact, in free verse. I used meters, I still use meters. Not that I have completely broken free from metrical structures, but I felt, like many other poets at that point of time, that it is not necessary that I confine my poetry to conventional metrical forms. I could use different kinds of forms. I could use prose. I could also use broken images and combine different kinds of ideas and combine space and time in my own way in poetry. It is not necessary to be chronological. It is not necessary that the space of the poem is a particular space alone, but I could speak in one line about maybe Mexico, and in another line about Kerala, and in another line about heaven or hell. So this kind of a freedom, spatial freedom, was offered by a poem like The Waste Land. And also, as I said, a freedom about time. I could speak about Mahabharata or Valmiki's Ramayana in one line, and then suddenly come to a poem by Idasheri or Vailopilli or any modern poet in any part of the world, maybe Pablo Neruda or Cesar Vallejo. So this kind of a freedom, spatial freedom, temporal freedom, structural and formal freedom, these were the main things that the Waste Land offered me as a poet. Even though later it is true, I broke out of that influence to a great extent, especially in the 70s when my poetry turned more political. But even then, something of that former influence was still there, something of that, the kind of atmosphere of liberation in linguistic and stylistic terms that the Waste Land offered. That stood with me. That was perhaps the lasting impact.
Similar trend of modernism sparked by the Waste Land was visible in the other regional languages of India too. Dr. E.B. Ramakrishnan, a noted poet and critic in both Malayalam and English, shares his views over this.
When we look back on T.S. Eliot's great poem, we are struck by its power to move the reader even today. It remains a post-World War poem in many ways. And it's not the mythical and the archaic references which appeal to us today, but the stark details of decadence and decay and personal kind of crisis, a sense of impending doom which Western civilization itself was going through. And all this had a great impact on Indian poets. By 1930s, let's actually look at the trajectory of modernism in Indian languages. You find the winds of change were sweeping Bangla poets, Buddhadev Bose, Shanga Ghosh, and Samarsan, and we have the great poet Jivanananda Das. All these poets had already begun writing, and there was a journal called Kallol Group had already begun moving away from Tagore's legacy. In fact, in a letter Buddhadev Bose wrote to Tagore, he says increasingly poems are going to be written in prose. And the last volume of Tagore's own poetry was not in the usual Tagorean style of musical and dense kind of poetic tone. It was in prose. There was a new generation of poets who had lost their faith in the prevailing ideologies, and they did turn away from this impulse to pontificate or moralize or comment on society. And when you turn to Hindi, you find Agyey. He was instrumental in inaugurating a phase of modernist poetry in Hindi, Tar Saptak brought in what you call Nai Kavita. And a series of, in Tar Saptak, you also find Kedarnath Singh, you find Mukti Bodh is one of those very strong modernist poets in Indian poetry. Though Agge wrote mostly about the personal alienation and about the need to use poetry as a kind of mode of probing the inner world. But in Mukti Bodh you find a concern with the outside chaotic, violent world of every day. Poetic language has ceased to communicate. The romantic, the nationalist, or the progressive, they all have used language in such a way that the poetic language can no more communicate what an authentic kind of experience. And the same concern you find in Mardekar. Mardekar is a major poet in Marathi. In 1947, he brought out a volume called Kahi Kavita. And Chitre, in the introduction, he actually says, war, death, mechanical life, lack of conviction, lack of faith, lack of ideals, a feeling of sickness, nausea, ennui, and a religious terror. All these actually are the major themes of this poem. When we move on to Kannada, you see, we have Adiga, and Adiga has two poems, I will mention two. You see, the inmates of this old house. In a way, it's an allegorical way of describing the state of poetry in the 50s, the inmates of the old house. And another very expressive, very well-known poem in Kannada is Do Something Brother, you see, appealing to people. We are all stuck. There is a sense of being, you see, a stalemate, the crisis of the soul. To conclude, you see, modernism is not a monolithic movement, neither in the West nor in Asia or in India. Modernism has many strands, including the radical political variety. When you take Mukti Bodh or Samarsan or maybe Satchidanandan or KGS, you do find a political modernism which actually emerges in the 60s in India.
Dr. Zahira Rahman, who is well known as a poet and painter, had taught the Waste Land for years during her professional life. Here, she elaborates on how a reader shall approach the text, which is perceived as an epic of modernism.
The fact that we are talking about it and the fact that it is important and significant even 100 years after it was published, it goes on to show that how relevant the poem or the epic poem is. I would call it an epic poem because it traces the journey towards a meaning, towards a solution, towards a goal, towards some answer. So I would say that Waste Land is not just a poem that reflects the reality of the times, the first half of the 20th century, devastated by war. I think it was T.S. Eliot's attempt to find an answer to the problems that beset mankind then and even now. When crisis situations arise, when evil confronts us, what do we do? Who are we? What is our purpose in life? All these are questions that really trouble us in times of crisis. Otherwise, we go with the tide. We don't bother. All the references that you have in the poem, all the languages that are spoken in the poem, the ancient, modern, all those myths that come together in the poem could be seen as a collective effort, a collective kind of voice, many stories that try and find answers, that go on this quest to meaning. So that is what the poem is doing. It does, I mean, these allusions do not obscure the poem. It enriches our understanding of the world. There is this poetic voice, Tiresias. He's not a man or a woman. He's a human being. And that is very important, that we see this poem as a quest, not of a woman or a man or any, I mean, it's not gendered. It's a poem that talks about, it's a poem that uses various allusions and various people in a collective effort. So there is no binary. You cannot read it as a feminist poem, or you cannot read it as patriarchal voice. As readers, we could undertake this journey of finding meaning in the poem. Allusions just enrich it. So when we talk about a poem, we are not talking about the content. We cannot simplify the content, because it is a poem, or poetry is using all the potentials of language. It is form and meaning blending together. So when you look at a poem, you have to look at the punctuations too. Somebody said, one of those lines of T.S. Eliot's seems, the punctuation in those lines seems very sad. I find it very interesting. Punctuations being sad. And so we have to look at everything in a poem. As readers, we have this responsibility of moving together with these people, with these numerous people, ancient and modern, trying to find meaning.
Aswin Vijayan, a young English poet based in Kozhikode, is emerging as the face of Indo-Anglian poetry by winning numerous accolades and achieving international recognition. Here, he will be talking over the contemporary relevance of the poem, The Waste Land.
T.S. Eliot was once described as a minor poet with a major poem. As a critic, he had a vision for how poetry should be and how English poetry should develop and evolve. And The Waste Land is kind of his manifestation of his ideas of what a poem should look like and how a poem, what are the duties a poem should perform. To think about The Waste Land is to think about its sprawl, the vastness of scope that the poem presents, both in terms of the sheer size of the poem and also the allusions that span across centuries that you see in a poem like The Waste Land. So this itself, this idea of being able to represent ideas, bring together ideas from different centuries, different eras to present, to talk about the thoughts of a generation, the thoughts of a war-torn generation, the thoughts of a war-torn Europe, is something new and nuanced that Eliot brings to us. April is the cruelest month. Eliot begins The Waste Land with an allusion to the first English poet, Chaucer, and he also sets the tone of the poem that he is here talking about a particular moral trouble, a troubled landscape is what he is presenting, and the thawing of the ice, that everything that was frozen is loosened and the immorality is just flowing. And he has this one particular, he uses this one particular image later in the poem, in the first section itself. He says, death has undone so many, and he portrays the people walking towards their jobs early in the morning, walking across the London Bridge. And this image kind of resonates with us, should resonate with us even today in this 21st century, because we see people talking about, we hear people talking about the alienation that we feel, because everybody is looking down at their devices, and even when they're walking in a crowd, they feel alone, alienated, or in their own worlds. This sensation was captured by Eliot so far back, where a generation was feeling that sense of alienation due to reasons like war and a sort of religious emptiness, religious void that they had felt. And Eliot was primarily a religious poet. Throughout his career, he was a religious poet. He starts asking the question, the religious question, beginning with Prufrock, one of his earliest major poems, in Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. He asks the question, or at least tries to formulate the moral question. But that question is not completely formulated in Prufrock, and he is not able to say it out loud that this is the problem, this is the dilemma that he is facing. But the persona in The Wasteland is able to formulate it, and he says that there is moral corruption. He is able to portray and show us the images of moral corruption, and he constantly juggles with the various alternatives, various religious and spiritual alternatives that would deliver us from this sort of corrupt environment. And his first suggestion is the red rock. There is shadow under this red rock, the rock being the Christian church and the Christian belief. He is suggesting that probably it is the Christian church, the Christian belief that would save us, that would deliver us from the corruption of the world. But as the poem progresses, there is an uncertainty, there is no trust in the church. So this sort of distrust he keeps building throughout the progress of the poem. He keeps building this distrust, and towards the end he probably suggests that there is somewhere else, the answer lies somewhere else, that we should probably look east. And that is why the poem ends with leading towards the Buddhist scripture and the thought of what the thunder said, and the words of the Eastern spiritual scriptures comes to play into this poem. And datta, dayatva, damyata, that is a solution that he proposes towards the end of the poem, and he ends it with shanti, 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 peace, peace, peace. That is the message with which he tries to end the poem.
The poem The Waste Land is divided into 5 sections, which are the burial of the dead, a game of chess, the fire sermon, death by water, and what the thunder said. Here, I'll be reciting a few lines from the second section of the poem, which is titled A Game of Chess. The chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble, where the glass held up by standards wrote in fruited wines, from which a golden Cupidon peeped out. Another hid his eyes behind his wing. Doubled the flames of 7-branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table as the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it, from satin cases poured in rich profusion. In vials of ivory and colored glass, unstoppered, lurked her strange synthetic perfumes, unguent, powdered, or liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned the scents and odors. Stirred by the air that freshened from the window, these ascended in fattening the prolonged candle flames, flung their smoke into the lacuria, stirring the pattern on the coffered ceiling. Hued seawood, fed with copper, burnt green and orange, framed by the colored stone, in which sad light a carved dolphin swam.